We'll be joining Fiachna O'Brien on for a late date in half an hour's time. First, though, here on RTE Radio 1, it's over to Fergal Keane for this week's Seascapes.
Hello, good evening and welcome to Seascapes. On tonight's programme, Flares Up, the epic story of a transatlantic row by Irish author Niamh McAnally, and a project to build a replica of a lifeboat lost in Fergal Sea 100 years ago. Flares Up is the title of a book by author Niamh McAnally, and it tells the story of how two inexperienced transatlantic rowers who undertook this epic adventure almost on a wing on a prayer. Niamh is part of the famous McAnally clan from Dublin. She's daughter of actor Ray and sister of musician and broadcaster Angus. She happened to be on a yacht in Antigua when she saw Paul Hopkins and Phil Pugh cross the finish line of their 3,000-mile transatlantic rowing race almost without fanfare. It was almost as if fate had placed her there, she says, to tell the story of these two men. Niamh McAnally and Paul Hopkins came into studio recently to tell me about that meeting and how it inspired this book, which today is number 2 on the Hodges Figures bestseller list. Niamh first told me of her own seagoing career.
Well, I actually took off a year once back in 2015 to travel around the world as a volunteer traveller, and I had finished it and I got this one opportunity to help crew a boat from Florida to the Bahamas, a 40-foot Cutterick sloop, and I would do it for a month, and I loved it so much. I actually met the captain, and the captain was Captain Gary, and we got on so well. When you're at sea, you get to know each other from the inside out, and we are since married, and that's the kind of rest is history. And we were in Antigua. We were cruising up and down the Caribbean, and we were in Antigua when the two lads rowed across the ocean and they came ashore, and Gary and I went out in our dinghy and we took a photograph of them, of their moment of triumph as they held their flares up, and it was so captivating. We invited Paul and Phil onto our boat the next night for dinner, and we started talking, and they realised I was a writer, and the book was born.
Yeah, but you've been at sea since you took that trip, more or less.
Yep, we took this sailboat from Florida to the Bahamas originally, back to Florida, up through the East Coast, right through New York Harbour, past the Statue of Liberty. Sailing there was like amazing. As an immigrant going into America, it was incredible. Up as far as Maine, turned around back down through the Caribbean again, all the different islands, down as far as Grenada and over to Bonaire and back again. So 6 years altogether we've been living on the boat.
Is that it's still your life?
We've actually just come ashore because of COVID, and we've chosen to pass the boat on to a new family. So there's a new family with 2 young children who are going to start off their career, if you like, sailing through the Bahamas as well. And we are between boats, shall we say.
What was it like spending 6 years on a boat, travelling to those beautiful places, warm waters most of the time?
Warm water's fantastic. One of the things about sailing, as most sailors know, is that it's not, people think you've got no boss. You just get on a sailboat, it's so romantic, you sail away. Well, obviously you do have a boss. The number one boss is the weather. So every morning, all day long, you're checking your weather. You're trying to see where should you go, where should you be in port. One of the things we learned early on was people would try and get into an anchorage the day before the storm was coming, but we learned to get in the day before, so you could get a spot to anchor. Otherwise it was just too crowded and you'd be out.
Okay, because those places you're riding out those storms at anchor rather than in a port.
Right, we would generally try and ride them out on anchor. Some of the worst ones we were in were about 30, 40 knot winds. So we became pretty much fair weather sailors. I wouldn't call us salty. We would stay in port as much as we could. We did get caught out by a couple of different, squalls and stuff like that we survived. One of the earlier ones, Gary was on, where I wasn't on the boat at the time, but it was a 60 knot squall off the coast of Georgia, I think it was, and they the bow was being buried at night, and it was suddenly went from being the sea lit up by the red and green lights to back up again. It goes, oh my God, this is so beautiful. Oh my God, we're going to die. Oh my God, this is so beautiful. So for those reasons, we tried to stay close in those situations, but we did a lot of open water passages. The longest was from Bahamas, Daniel Key down to Puerto Rico. That was a 10-day open water passage.
Okay.
And that was pretty rough. We had waves crashing in through the main hatch, which soaked the bedroom, and then we were kind of hot bunking it. We had one other guy who'd sailed the Atlantic on as a third person, just to keep the watch rotation a little easier for us. And then when I got off in Puerto Rico, I sort of kissed the ground and I said to Gary, well, I've done 2 open water passages in one. And he goes, how's that? My first and my last. But no, that wasn't true at all. We've been sailing since, and we just loved it.
If somebody might be happening to go down around that part of the world, where would you recommend?
If you want the clear, beautiful waters, the Exumas in the Bahamas, absolutely stunning. They say if you find a place where there's somebody on a beach, you just go to the next island and you have your own little spot.
It sounds really beautiful, but we're here today to talk about something a bit more difficult, because your book flares up a story bigger than the Atlantic. It's about 2 men who decided to row across the Atlantic from the Canaries. One of them is here, Paul Hopkins. Paul, welcome. You're not spring chickens, if I can put it like that, but the 2 of you decided to do this challenge.
2014, I had a health issue. I'd never been as fit, and I had a bleed on the brain. I think that experience changed my outlook. When you think you've got 20 years left and I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, you're going to do all these different things, but as we know, it might not be the case. So when opportunity arose, I just couldn't turn it down. So
you sailed on the Talisker Atlantic Challenge, with the Talisker being the sponsor. Tell me about the boat you had, and how did it come that you decided to do this with Phil? I worked in the fire service in Tyne and Wear in Newcastle. So we had a fireboat that covered the River Tyne. So because it could go out to sea, we had to have sea survival qualifications. So we went to the Nautical College, of course, down one side of the room, white shirts, gold braiding, shipping companies. And then, of course, the rest of us were firefighters getting a qualification. And there was one gentleman there. And at dinner time, I said to him, why are you here? And he says, I'm going to row between Newcastle and Amsterdam, 400 miles. And I said, well, why would you do that when there's a ferry and a bar and a bed? And he goes, ocean rowing is a massive sport, and I'd never heard of it. So when I looked up ocean rowing, there's races all over the world. So I did what any normal person would do. I Googled the world's toughest rowing race, and the Atlantic Crossing came up. I watched a promotional video and thought, I'm doing that. You bought a boat, 20 foot, fourth hand. Yes. And Phil is 65. At the time of the crossing, yes. Phil was 65, I was 55, the younger of the 2. That was 2019. You must be very apprehensive the day you hit the start line. It was a strange sensation. It had taken 3.5 years of fundraising. I hadn't thought that much about actual starting the event, because all the focus had been getting to the start line. So when we left the harbour, it was just so many mixed emotions. Tad embarrassing. Before we got about 500 metres offshore before we hit one of the buoys, with everybody watching, which wasn't a great start, but it was a start. So tell me about the boat, 20 foot. It's called a Woodville's pair. So it was built in 2009 by a gentleman called Roger Haynes. He built in his garage. Back in the day when the race was for more adventurous sorts, when you applied to join the race, they sent you the boat as a flat pack, and you built your boat and you raced it. Yeah, we've had people on the programme before, both who've rowed the Atlantic and also built their own boats like that. It has a little cabin on either end, a tiny little cubby hole. It does, yeah. It's got a storage at the front, and then obviously we had a small living compartment to the rear of the boat. Hot food? Yes, hot food. We had boiler, and then obviously we had the water maker. But what we miss most, hot food's great, but you miss a cold drink. Okay.
would have been something you would die for.
How long did it take you to get across?
70 days.
Oh, that's pretty good.
It's the fastest that the boat's called DD, Dream It, Do It. So it's the fastest crossing DD had done on a 4th attempt. So we were pleased with it. We were 32nd out of 35 boats, but DD cost me £10,000, including the boat, the trailer and some equipment. And the next cheapest boat in the race was £45,000.
Okay. You had difficult times though.
We did everything on a budget, and then I learned why things are cheap.
Because they break.
Yes, and I also learnt that the sea is a very difficult mistress. She will find any weakness and exploit it, whether it's your boat, your equipment, or you as an individual.
What was the low point?
There was more than one. I suffer with gout, so Christmas morning I woke up with gout. If Rudolph had had the day off, you could have used me toe. So I had to strap my foot into the rowing position and row for 15 hours of the day. So that was a low point, and then of course being away from the family at Christmas.
Weather-wise? The wind should be behind you, the following sea as well?
Yeah, it should have been. The trade winds were sadly lacking the year we went across. So ours being the Woodville, it gets less windage, so it doesn't get as much advantage, where the Rannoch boats, the newer ones, are designed to have a larger back end and more of a push, shall we say.
How many miles would you cover a day?
The most we did was 50, and the least we did was 17. There was a day where it was pan flat, no wind, no movement, and it was like rowing through treacle, and I absolutely flogged myself for the day. And when we got the number of 17, I could have just sat and cried. There was days we went backwards, so -8 miles, so that's not a good start to the day either.
You would think going across the Atlantic you would see quite a lot of wildlife, but sometimes that's not the case.
We did see quite a bit of wildlife. We saw too many super tankers that frighten the living daylights out of us when they appear on the horizon. But for a highlight, I wanted to see whales. Day 53, middle of the afternoon, just rowing, mind oblivious, and all of a sudden I was covered in water. A whale appeared at the side of the boat, cleared its blowhole, wet us through, and I'm shouting for Phil to come out of the cabin. Phil, there's a whale. And it would have been no more than 20 feet off the port side. And it just looked at us as we were looking at it, and then it realised there was not much to see. So it just arched its back, slipped into the water, and then was gone. Never made a splash. And within 2 hours of that, we saw 2 more smaller whales, not quite as close, but yeah, amazing to see animals in their habitat.
After 70 days you put into Antigua, you didn't really have a reception committee there?
No, neither of us had any friends or family there. It makes us sound like a pair of saddos, but obviously the expense and things of that nature. So the race organisers had put a call out amongst the yachting community to say that 2 sailors were arriving with no friends, could they come to the quayside? And fortunately enough, Niamh answered the call.
Niamh, that's where you came in.
Yes, that we were, Gary and I were sitting just in the cockpit having a late lunch, and we heard they're coming. And the day before I had seen one of these rowboats, one of the ones from years ago, and I was like, I couldn't fathom somebody would be in that and would actually row across the Atlantic in it. And the idea that we might see somebody coming in. So Gary and I jumped in the dinghy, went out, and we started taking the photographs, which is actually now the cover of Flares Up. That moment when Paul and Phil stood up and lit their handheld flares was such an emotional moment for me. I just felt connected to them. I'd never met them in my life before. And Gary and I then invited them onto our boat for dinner the next night. And we joke about it. Paul had to call his wife and sort of said, we're going on with these super yachts, because the place is full of super yachts down there. I said, no, sweetie, it's just a 40-foot sailboat. And he goes, it's a super yacht to us after 70 days in a rowboat. And we talked that night. And what I had said to Paul was, your story is incredible. It gives me goosebumps. But in terms of writing a book, I don't want to write something that is just for a little small community that is how to row an ocean. What I want to know is, why you wrote it, how did it affect your families, and when in a couple of months' time, when you've had a chance to reflect on it, how has it changed? How's this experience changed you as human beings? And I think that's one of the things we've explored through this last year in writing the book, that it has definitely been a changing experience for you, wouldn't you say, Paul?
It's very much been a changing experience. I found being at sea quite an almost spiritual experience. There was times where the sea was huge swells, and it was just picking the whole boat up and just carrying you forward. It wasn't a wave, it was just a mass of water.
And that was Paul Hopkins. Flares Up by Niamh McAnally is published by Pitch Publishing. And Niamh has written it like a novel, so it works as a great read for everyone. And as I said, today it's at number 2 in the Hodges Figgis bestsellers list.